Boring history for sleep. How medieval peasants survived the coldest nights and more. Welcome to a long, quiet journey into the past, where we linger on the simple, unchanging lives of medieval peasants in Europe, particularly during the cold, dark nights of winter. Tonight, we will explore, in great detail, how these humble folk survived the harshest seasons, how they built their homes, prepared their meals, mended their clothes, tended their animals, and carried out the countless small tasks that filled their days and nights. This is a story of routine, of repetition, of a world where nothing happened quickly, where every action was deliberate and familiar. Let us begin with the homes they lived in, the modest shelters that stood against the biting winds of a medieval winter. And we will take our time, dwelling on every small detail, as the peasants did, night after night, year after year. In the villages of medieval Europe, from the 10th to the 15th centuries, peasants lived in homes that were built with whatever materials the land provided. In England, many homes were constructed using a method called wattle and daub, a process so slow and methodical that it could take weeks to complete a single small house. The first step was to gather thin branches, often from hazel or willow trees that grew near the village. The peasants would walk to the edge of the forest, carrying a simple iron axe or a knife with a wooden handle. They would choose branches that were straight and flexible, cutting them carefully, one by one, and tying them into bundles with twine made from flax. These bundles were carried back to the village, a journey that might take an hour or more, depending on the distance. The branches were then sorted by size, laid out on the ground, and trimmed to the right length with a small saw or knife. This was done slowly, with no rush, as the peasants knew the work would take time. Once the branches were ready, they were woven together to form a lattice. Much like a basket, the peasants would sit or stand, weaving each branch over and under the others, creating a tight, sturdy frame. This lattice was the skeleton of the wall, and it had to be strong enough to hold the weight of the daub. The weaving was done by hand, with each branch placed carefully, checked, and adjusted. If a branch was too thick or too thin, it was set aside for another use, perhaps as kindling for the fire. The process of weaving a single wall could take days, and a whole house might require weeks of work, especially if the family was working alone. The peasants did not hurry. They worked at a steady pace, stopping to eat, rest, or tend to other chores, and then returning to the task with the same calm focus. When the lattice was complete, the peasants turned to making the daub. This was a mixture of mud, straw, and sometimes animal dung, gathered from the fields or a nearby stream. The mud was dug with a wooden shovel, its blade worn smooth from years of use. The straw came from the harvest, saved from the fields where barley or wheat had been cut. The dung, if used, was collected from the animals kept near the house, perhaps a cow or a pig. The peasants would mix these materials in a shallow pit, using their hands or a wooden stick to blend them together. Water was added slowly, carried from a stream in a wooden bucket that leaked slightly at the seams. The mixing was a slow process, as the daub needed to be just the right consistency, not too wet, not too dry. The peasants would test it by squeezing a handful, checking to see if it held its shape. If it was too crumbly, they added more water. If too runny, more straw. This testing and adjusting could take hours, as they worked to get it just right. The daub was then applied to the lattice by hand. The peasants would scoop up handfuls of the mixture, pressing it into the woven branches, smoothing it with their fingers or a flat piece of wood. Each layer was applied carefully, filling every gap in the lattice. The first layer was left to dry for a day or two, depending on the weather. If it was too cold or damp, the drying could take longer, and the peasants would wait patiently, checking the wall each day. Once dry, another layer was added, and then another, until the wall was thick and solid. The finished wall was not smooth or perfect. It had bumps and cracks, and the straw often poked through the surface, but it was enough to keep out most of the wind, though the cold still seeped through on the harshest nights. The roof of the peasant's home was made of thatch, which was straw or reeds gathered from the fields or nearby marshes. Thatching was a skill passed down through generations, and every village had someone who knew how to do it well. The straw was collected after the harvest, when the fields were full of stubble. the peasants would walk through the fields, gathering the straw into bundles, tying each one with twine made from flax or hemp. The bundles were carried back to the house, stacked neatly, and left to dry in the sun. If the weather was wet, the straw might be spread out under a shelter, perhaps a lean-to made of branches, to keep it from molding. The drying process could take days or even weeks, and the peasants would check the straw regularly, turning it to ensure it dried evenly. When the straw was ready, it was layered onto a wooden frame that formed the roof. The frame was made of beams cut from oak or ash, shaped with an axe and fastened with wooden pegs. The peasants would climb onto the roof with a ladder, often just a series of branches lashed together. They would lay the straw bundles one by one, starting at the bottom and working up to the ridge of the roof. Each bundle was tied down with twine or pegs, placed so that it overlapped the one below it, ensuring that rain would run off rather than seep through. The work was slow and repetitive, with each bundle placed carefully, checked, and adjusted. A single roof might take weeks to complete, depending on the size of the house and the number of people working. Once finished, the thatch was thick and heavy, but it was not perfect. Wind could find small gaps, and rain might drip through if the thatch was old or poorly maintained. Every year, the peasants would climb up to inspect the roof, patching holes or replacing worn sections with fresh straw, always using the same methods, always taking their time. Inside the home, there was little to shield against the cold. Most peasant houses had just one room, perhaps 20 feet long and 10 feet wide, where the entire family lived, ate, and slept. The floor was usually packed earth, smoothed by years of footsteps. In some homes, the peasants spread straw or rushes on the floor to add a bit of insulation. Though this straw would become damp and matted over time, replacing it was a regular task, done every few weeks or months. The peasants would sweep out the old straw with a broom made of twigs tied to a stick, a tool they made themselves. They would gather fresh straw from the fields or from a pile stored near the house, scattering it across the floor and pressing it down with their feet. The straw did not stay clean for long. It collected dirt, food scraps, and bits of ash from the fire. But the peasants did not mind. It was just another part of their routine, another small task in a life full of small tasks. The hearth was the heart of the peasant home, a simple fire pit in the center of the room, surrounded by stones to keep the flames from spreading. The hearth was used for heat, light, and cooking, and it was tended with great care. Starting a fire was a daily ritual. The peasants would gather firewood from the nearby forest, often under strict rules set by the local lord, who might limit how much wood they could take. They carried the wood in bundles, tied with rope or carried on their backs, a task that could take hours if the forest was far away. At home, they used flint and steel to create a spark, striking the flint against the steel until a small ember caught on tinder, such as dry grass, bits of bark, or even old cloth. The tinder was placed in a small pile, and the peasant would blow gently, coaxing the ember into a flame. Small twigs were added first, then larger sticks, and finally logs, each one placed carefully to keep the fire burning steadily. The wood was precious, and the peasants could not afford to let it burn too quickly. They would add logs one at a time, watching the fire, adjusting the logs with a stick to ensure it burned evenly. The smoke from the fire filled the room, as most peasant homes had no chimney. It rose and escaped through a hole in the roof, but not before leaving a layer of soot on the walls and ceiling. The air was thick with the smell of burning wood, straw, and sometimes the faint odor of cooking food. The smoke irritated the eyes and throat, but the peasants were used to it. They spent their evenings by the fire, their faces lit by the flickering flames, their hands busy with small tasks. The fire was their only source of warmth, but it was not enough on the coldest nights. The wattle and daub walls let in drafts, and the thatched roof did little to trap heat. The cold was a constant presence, seeping into the room, chilling the floor, and making the air feel heavy and damp. To stay warm, the peasants relied on their clothing and bedding. During the day, they wore simple garments made of wool or linen. A man might wear a tunic that reached his knees, paired with hose tied at the waist with a cord. A woman might wear a long dress with a simple apron, tied with a cloth belt. Both might have a cloak, fastened with a wooden or bone pin, to wear when they went outside. These clothes were made by hand, often by the women of the household. Wool came from sheep sheared in the spring, a task done with iron shears that were sharpened on a whetstone. The wool was washed in a stream, spread out to dry, and then carded with a wooden comb to align the fibers. Carding was a slow process, done with two combs that were rubbed together, pulling the wool into smooth strands. The carded wool was then spun into thread using a drop spindle, a small stick with a weight at one end. Spinning was done in the evenings, by the fire, with the spindle twirling in a steady, rhythmic motion. A single skein of thread could take hours to produce, and a whole tunic might require dozens of skeins. The thread was woven into cloth on a loom, a wooden frame that stood in a corner of the house. Weaving was another slow task, with the shuttle passing back and forth, the threads pressed down with a wooden comb. A single piece of cloth could take days or even weeks to complete. Depending on its size, the finished cloth was rough and heavy, especially if made from wool. It was sewn into garments using needles made of bone or iron, with threads spun from the same wool or from flax grown in the fields. Sewing was done by hand, each stitch placed carefully to ensure the garment would last. A tunic might be worn for years, patched and mended as it wore thin. The patches were cut from old cloth, sewn on with the same careful stitches, and the garment was used until it could no longer be repaired. At night, the peasants did not change into special sleepwear. They slept in their daytime clothes or in simple linen shifts, which were loose and comfortable. The bed was the most important piece of furniture, though it was not much like the beds we know today. Most peasants slept on a straw mattress, a sack filled with straw or hay from the fields. The straw was gathered in late summer, after the harvest, and dried carefully to prevent mold. The peasants would carry the straw in bundles, stuffing it into a sack made of coarse linen or hemp. The sack was sewn shut with a needle and thread, and the mattress was placed on the floor or on a simple wooden frame. Just a few boards nailed together. The straw flattened over time, and the mattress needed to be refilled every few months. The peasants would open the sack, pull out the old straw, and stuff it with fresh straw, shaking it to distribute the filling evenly. Some might add dried herbs, like lavender or chamomile, to mask the smell of the straw, but this was rare. The mattress was covered with a woolen blanket, heavy and coarse, often patched from years of use. In wealthier households, there might be a linen sheet, but most peasants made do with blankets alone. To stay warm, entire families slept together in one bed. A family of 5 or 6 might share a single mattress, their body heat helping to keep the cold at bay. On the coldest nights, they would pile extra blankets or cloaks on top, creating a heavy pile that trapped some warmth. The blankets were thick, made of wool woven on the same loom as their clothes. They were heavy, sometimes weighing as much as the mattress itself, and they were patched with scraps of cloth when they wore thin. The weight of the blankets, the closeness of the family, and the faint glow of the dying fire created a small pocket of comfort in an otherwise cold and drafty room. The peasants would lie close, their breath visible in the air, and wait for sleep to come. The room was dark, as candles and lamps were expensive and rare. The only light came from the hearth, and when the fire burned low, the room was nearly pitch black. The darkness made the nights feel longer, the cold more oppressive. To pass the time, some peasants might tell stories, often the same tales their parents had told them, passed down through generations. These were not grand adventures but simple stories about the land, the seasons, or the lives of saints. The stories were told in a slow, familiar way, with no surprises, no excitement. Others might pray, reciting prayers in a soft, rhythmic chant. The prayers were learned by heart, taught by the village priest, and repeated night after night. The words were comforting in their familiarity, a steady drone that filled the silence of the winter night. The peasants might pray for a good harvest, for health, or for protection from the cold, their voices blending with the sound of the wind outside. Beyond the home, the peasant's life was shaped by the seasons. Winter was a time of rest, but it was also a time of careful planning. Food was scarce, and the peasants had to make their supplies last until spring. In the fall, they harvested crops like barley, wheat, and oats, carrying them in baskets to the village. The grain was stored in wooden bins or clay pots, sealed with wax to keep out mice and dampness. The bins were made by a local carpenter, their planks cut from oak and nailed together with iron nails. The clay pots were shaped by a potter, fired in a kiln, and carried carefully to the house. Root vegetables, such as turnips, carrots, or parsnips, were buried in pits lined with straw to keep them from freezing. The pits were dug by hand, with a wooden shovel or a simple spade. The peasants would dig a shallow hole, line it with straw, and place the vegetables inside, covering them with more straw and earth. Every few weeks, they would dig into the pit, brushing off the dirt and carrying a few vegetables back to the house. Meat was preserved by salting or smoking, a process that took days of careful work. In late fall, a family might slaughter a pig, a task done with a sharp knife and a steady hand. The pig was hung in the rafters of the home, where the smoke from the hearth would slowly cure the meat. The process was slow, with the meat turned every few days to ensure it cured evenly. Every part of the animal was used. The fat was rendered for cooking, boiled in a clay pot until it turned to liquid. The bones were boiled for broth, simmered for hours over the fire. The intestines were cleaned and used as casings for sausages, stuffed with bits of meat and fat. The smell of curing meat filled the house, mixing with the smoke and the scent of straw. The peasants worked slowly, carefully, ensuring nothing was wasted. The daily routine of a peasant was unchanging. Even in winter, they woke at dawn, roused by the cold or the sound of a rooster. The first task was to tend the fire, adding wood and blowing on the embers to bring it back to life. The wood was stacked outside the house, covered with straw or branches to keep it dry. Breakfast was simple, often a piece of bread made from barley or rye, or a porridge of oats boiled in a clay pot over the fire. The bread was baked in a communal oven, if the village had one, or in a small clay oven near the hearth. Baking was a weekly task. The dough was mixed by hand, kneaded on a wooden board, and left to rise near the fire. Kneading was a slow, rhythmic task. The dough pressed and folded for 10 or 15 minutes until it was smooth. The bread was shaped into round loaves, scored with a knife, and baked until it was hard and crusty. A single loaf might last a family for days, eaten with cheese, broth, or a bit of fat. After breakfast, the day was filled with small chores. In winter, there was less work in the fields, but the animals still needed care. A peasant might have a few chickens, a pig, or a cow, kept in a small shed attached to the house or even inside the home for warmth. Feeding the animals meant scattering grain for the chickens or carrying water from a stream, which might be frozen in the coldest months. The water was carried in wooden buckets, which were heavy and often leaked. Repairing a bucket was a common task. A peasant might carve a new piece of wood to patch a crack, soaking the bucket in water to make the wood swell and seal. The chickens laid eggs, which were collected daily and stored in a basket or a clay pot. The cow, if the family had one, was milked twice a day. The milk poured into a clay jug or churned into butter. Churning was a slow task, done with a wooden churn that was rocked back and forth for hours. The butter was stored in a clay pot, sealed with a cloth to keep it fresh. The tools of a peasant's life were simple and sturdy. A wooden plow, pulled by an ox or by hand, was used to till the fields. A sickle, with a curved iron blade and a wooden handle, was used to harvest crops. These tools were made by a local blacksmith or carpenter, or sometimes by the peasants themselves. A sickle, for example, was forged from iron, the blade hammered into shape over hours of work. The handle was carved from ash or oak, smoothed with a knife, and attached with leather strips or iron nails. Maintaining these tools was a constant task. A peasant might spend an evening sharpening a sickle with a whetstone, the repetitive scraping sound blending with the crackle of the fire. The whetstone was a simple tool, a flat piece of rock carried from a nearby quarry, and it was used until it wore smooth. Other tools included a wooden rake for gathering straw, a hoe for weeding, and a spade for digging. Each was made by hand, repaired by hand, and used day after day in the same unchanging way. Clothing, like tools, was made to last. A peasant's tunic might be worn for years, patched and mended as it wore thin. Sewing was done with a bone or iron needle, and thread was spun from wool or flax. Mending a garment was a slow task, each stitch placed carefully to ensure the fabric would hold. A single repair might take an hour, and a peasant might spend many evenings by the fire. Sewing in the dim light, their hands moving in a steady, familiar rhythm. The cloth was often dyed with natural colors, like woad for blue or madder for red, but these colors faded over time, leaving the garments a muted gray or brown. The dyes were made from plants gathered in the fields or woods, boiled in a pot over the fire. The process was slow, with the plants soaked for days to extract the color, then mixed with water and applied to the cloth. The cloth was soaked, stirred, and left to dry, a process that could take weeks. The village was a quiet place in winter. The fields lay fallow, covered in frost or snow. The church was the center of village life, and peasants attended services regularly, walking through the cold to hear the priest recite prayers in Latin. The church was often as cold as their homes, its stone walls offering little warmth, but it was a place of routine, where the same prayers were said week after week, year after year. The familiarity of the words, the cadence of the priest's voice, was comforting in its predictability. After the service, the peasants might linger in the churchyard, exchanging news or discussing the weather, their breath visible in the cold air. The churchyard was also where the village buried its dead, in simple graves marked with wooden crosses or stones. Digging a grave was a slow task, done with a spade in the hard, frozen ground, and it was a reminder of the cycle of life in the village. As the day ended, the peasants returned to their homes. The fire was stoked again, and supper was prepared. This might be a stew of vegetables and a small piece of meat, cooked in a clay pot over the fire. The pot was stirred slowly, the ingredients blending together over hours. The stew might include turnips, onions, and a bit of barley, with a small piece of salted pork for flavor. The pork was cut with a knife, its blade sharpened on a whetstone before each use. Eating was a quiet affair. The family gathered around the hearth, sharing a single bowl or trencher made of wood. The trencher was carved by hand, its surface worn smooth from years of use. After supper, the family might sit by the fire, repairing tools, mending clothes, or simply resting. The day ended as it began, with the fire at the center of their world. The peasants also had to manage their resources carefully. Water was a constant concern. In winter, streams and wells might freeze, forcing the peasants to break the ice with a stick or melt it over the fire. The water was used for drinking, cooking, and washing, though washing was rare in the coldest months. Clothes were cleaned infrequently, often just brushed off or beaten with a stick to remove dirt. Dishes, if they had any, were wiped clean with a cloth or a handful of straw. Hygiene was simple, and the peasants did not think much of it. Their focus was on survival, on making it through each day and each night. The tools they used for cooking were basic. A clay pot, a wooden spoon, and a small knife were often all they had. The pot was made by a local potter, shaped from clay dug from the riverbank and fired in a kiln. The spoon was carved from wood, its handle worn smooth from years of use. The knife was a prized possession, its blade sharpened regularly with a whetstone. These tools were used day after day, year after year, in the same unchanging way. The pot was placed on a tripod of stones over the fire, or hung from a hook made of iron. The peasants would stir the food slowly, watching it cook, adding water or herbs as needed. The herbs were gathered in the summer, dried, and stored in small cloth bags, hung near the fire to keep them dry. The peasants' lives were governed by the rhythm of the seasons. In winter, they stayed close to home, but they still had work to do. They might repair fences, made of woven branches or stacked stones, that surrounded their fields. The fences were checked regularly, as animals or weather could damage them. Repairing a fence meant gathering new branches or stones, carrying them to the field, and placing them carefully to fill the gaps. They might weave baskets, using the same techniques as their walls, to store grain or carry firewood. The baskets were made from willow or reeds, cut and woven by hand, a process that could take hours for a single basket. They might spin wool or flax, the spindle twirling in their hands as they sat by the fire. Spinning was a task that never ended, as thread was always needed for clothes, blankets, or repairs. The animals in the village were another responsibility. Chickens were fed grain or scraps from the table. Their eggs collected daily and stored in a basket or a clay pot. A cow, if the family had one, was milked twice a day. The milk poured into a clay jug or churned into butter. Churning was a slow task, done with a wooden churn that was rocked back and forth for hours. The butter was stored in a clay pot, sealed with a cloth to keep it fresh. The pig, if they had one, was fed scraps and grain, and its pen was cleaned regularly to keep it from becoming too muddy. The pen was made of wooden stakes driven into the ground, tied together with rope or branches. The animals were a source of food and warmth, and their care was a daily task that never changed. The peasants also had to deal with the weather. Snow could block paths to the village, making it hard to visit neighbors or attend church. They might spend hours clearing a path, using a wooden shovel or even their hands. The snow was piled to the side, creating small walls that lined the paths. Rain was another challenge, as it could leak through the thatched roof or turn the dirt floor into mud. The peasants would patch the roof or spread more straw on the floor. Small tasks that kept their homes livable. If the roof leaked, they might place a wooden bucket or a clay pot under the drip, emptying it regularly to keep the floor dry. In the evenings, the peasants might gather with neighbors. Though this was rare in winter, they might share a story or a song, but these were simple, often the same ones told for generations. The stories were about the land, the seasons, or the lives of saints, told in a slow, familiar way. The songs were sung softly, their melodies repetitive and soothing. These moments were a way to pass the time, to fill the quiet of the long nights. The peasants might also repair their tools or clothes, sitting by the fire, their hands moving in a steady rhythm. A broken tool might be fixed with a new handle, carved from wood and fitted carefully. A torn garment might be patched with a scrap of cloth, sewn with small, even stitches. As the winter wore on, the peasants looked forward to spring, but they did not rush. Their lives were built on patience, on doing the same things day after day. They knew the cold would pass, that the fields would thaw, and that life would continue as it always had. For now, they focused on the small tasks: the fire, the food, the bed, and the warmth of their families. They lived in a world where change was slow, where every task was done by hand, and where the rhythm of life was steady and predictable. The peasants also had to maintain their homes. The wattle and daub walls could crack in the cold, and the peasants would patch them with more daub, mixed in the same pit, applied in the same way. The thatched roof needed regular care, with new straw added to worn sections. The peasants would climb up with their ladder, carrying bundles of straw, tying them down with twine. The work was slow, and it was done in the same way every year. The hearth needed cleaning, too, as ash built up over time. The peasants would scoop out the ash with a wooden shovel, carrying it outside to spread on the fields as fertilizer. The stones around the hearth were checked for cracks, and any loose ones were reset with a bit of mud or clay. The peasants' tools were not just for farming. They also used them for building and repairing. A hammer, made of iron with a wooden handle, was used to drive nails or pegs. A saw, with a blade forged by the blacksmith, was used to cut wood for fences or furniture. These tools were simple, but they were essential, and they were cared for with great attention. A peasant might spend an evening oiling a wooden handle with fat from the kitchen, rubbing it in to keep the wood from splitting. The iron blades were cleaned with a cloth to prevent rust, and sharpened with a whetstone. The whetstone itself was a tool, carried from a quarry or traded from another village, and it was used until it was worn smooth. The peasants' lives were also shaped by their community. The village was small, often just a dozen or so houses, clustered around a church or a manor. The manor belonged to the local lord, who owned the land and set the rules. The peasants worked the lord's fields as part of their rent, growing crops like barley or wheat. They also paid taxes, often in the form of grain, eggs, or other goods. The taxes were collected by the lord's steward, who kept careful records on parchment or wax tablets. The peasants would bring their goods to the manor, carrying them in baskets or sacks, and the steward would count each item, making sure the amount was correct. This was a slow process, with each basket emptied, counted, and recorded, and the peasants stood patiently, waiting for the steward to finish. The church was not just a place of worship but also a place of community. The peasants gathered there for festivals, like Christmas or Easter. Though these were simple affairs in a peasant village, Christmas might mean a special meal, perhaps with a bit of meat or a loaf of bread made from finer flour. Easter might include eggs, dyed with plant juices and shared among the family. These festivals were rare moments of celebration, but they were still modest. With no great feasts or lavish decorations, the peasants would sit in the church, listening to the priest, their hands folded, their minds on the tasks waiting at home. The peasants' lives were also shaped by the land. The fields were their livelihood, and they spent much of the year preparing them. In winter, the fields were quiet, but there was still work to do. The peasants might spread manure on the fields, carried from the animal pens in wooden carts or baskets. The manure was spread by hand, a slow and unpleasant task, but it was necessary to enrich the soil for the next planting. They might also repair the plows, checking the wooden frame for cracks or sharpening the iron blade. The plow was heavy, and plowing was hard work, done in the spring when the ground thawed. But in winter, the peasants prepared, making sure their tools were ready, their fields planned, and their supplies secure. As the night grew late, the peasants prepared for sleep. The straw mattress was fluffed, the blankets arranged, and the family climbed into bed. The fire was banked, the logs arranged to burn slowly through the night. The room grew dark, and the cold crept in, but the peasants were accustomed to it. They lay close together, their breath visible in the air, and waited for sleep. The night was long, but it was just one of many, each blending into the next in a life of quiet, unchanging routine. This was the life of a medieval peasant, a life of repetition and simplicity. They survived the coldest nights with fire, wool, and the closeness of their families. They lived in homes built by hand, with tools they made themselves. In a world where everything was done slowly and carefully, their days were filled with small tasks: gathering wood, spinning thread, mending clothes, tending animals, patching walls, and stoking the fire. Their nights were spent in darkness, warmed only by the fire and their blankets. Their lives unfolding in the same predictable way, night after night, year after year, century after century. And as we drift off to sleep, we can imagine them lying in their beds, listening to the wind outside, their world quiet, their tasks small, and their lives steady, unchanging, and calm. And so, the lives of medieval peasants carried on, night after night, in a world of quiet repetition. They survived the coldest winters with their simple fires, their heavy woolen blankets, and the warmth of their families. Huddled together in small, drafty homes, their days were filled with endless tasks: gathering wood, spinning thread, mending clothes, tending animals, and preparing food, all done with the same slow, deliberate care, year after year, century after century. Their world was one of routine, of small, unchanging moments that blended into the rhythm of the seasons. As we drift off to sleep, we can picture them lying in their beds, the fire burning low, the wind whispering outside, their lives steady and calm. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, please consider liking this video, sharing it with others, and subscribing to the Hidden Hour for more soothing tales of history. Until next time, rest well, and good night. This conclusion is approximately 150 words, keeping the tone consistent with the essay's sleep-inducing style while incorporating the call to action for your YouTube channel. It can be narrated slowly to maintain the calming effect, potentially with soft background sounds like a fading fire or gentle wind. If you need adjustments, such as a longer or shorter conclusion, or specific formatting for narration, e.g. with pauses or sound cues, let me know.